My family called me the failure. They said I had no degree, no fancy job. You will end up homeless. My brother Derek sneered at every holiday gathering. At our family reunion, my father demanded everyone go around the table and share their life wins. My brother boasted about his vice president title. My sister bragged about being a surgeon. When it was my turn, I did not list an accomplishment. I simply stated one number: my net worth. The table went dead quiet. My father asked me to repeat it. I did, and my golden boy brother walked out without a single word. My name is Gemma. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder of a highly successful logistics software company that I just quietly sold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit silently while toxic family members underestimated your worth. The setting was a sprawling luxury Airbnb in Lake Tahoe, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark water and a massive custom oak dining table that my parents had demanded we rent for the occasion. The entire weekend had been a masterclass in passive aggression. My mother Brenda had spent the first 2 days loudly asking if I needed to borrow money for groceries, while my father Richard made a point of introducing my siblings to the neighboring vacationers while conveniently forgetting I was standing right there. We were seated for a catered dinner on Saturday night when my father clinked his crystal wine glass with a heavy silver spoon. He stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out with the unearned pride of a man who believed his children's accomplishments were solely his doing. He announced it was time for our traditional game of life wins. This was not a fun family tradition. It was a calculated ritual designed specifically to stroke Derek and Sienna's egos while publicly humiliating me. It was the trap they set every single year. My father pointed his glass at Derek first. Derek leaned back in his chair, swirling his expensive bourbon with an air of absolute superiority. At 36, he was the undisputed golden boy of the family. He had just been promoted to vice president of operations at a mid-sized tech firm. He spent the next 20 minutes giving us a verbal presentation without the slides. He bragged endlessly about his new stock options, his sprawling corner office, and his shiny new Porsche 911 parked out in the driveway. He made sure to loudly mention how his beautiful wife Simone, a high-powered corporate attorney sitting next to him, loved the heated leather seats. Simone gave a polite, tight-lipped smile, adjusting her designer watch, choosing to stay out of the family theatrics for the moment. My parents practically vibrated with joy. My mother clapped her hands together, telling Derek how brilliant he was, while my father nodded solemnly, declaring that Derek was carrying on the family legacy of excellence and wealth. Then the spotlight moved to Sienna. At 34, my sister was a cosmetic surgeon who carried herself like she had personally cured a major disease. She flipped her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder and launched into a monologue about her brand new private clinic in Beverly Hills. She casually dropped the names of minor celebrities she claimed to have consulted with, complaining about how exhausting it was to be in such high demand. She sighed dramatically, talking about the grueling renovations on her new facility and the imported Italian marble she had chosen for the waiting room lobby. My mother gasped in admiration, reaching over to squeeze Sienna's hand. She told Sienna that her massive success was a testament to all the expensive private tutoring they had paid for when she was a teenager. I just sat there quietly cutting my steak watching the performance. I did not feel sad. I did not feel excluded. I felt like I was watching a poorly written stage play where everyone was reading from a script of delusion. When the applause for Sienna finally died down, the air in the room shifted entirely. All eyes turned to me. The warmth vanished from my father's face, replaced by a tight, condescending smirk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood table, treating me like a charity case who had wandered into a private country club. "And Gemma," he said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "What about you? Are you still doing your little internet typing gigs? Still trying to make those computer programs work out for you?" Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Derek let out a loud, mocking bark of laughter. He pointed his silver fork at me across the table. You know, Gemma, he interrupted. I was actually going to talk to you about that after dinner. My department at the firm is expanding next quarter. We always need low-level data entry clerks. The pay is basically minimum wage, but I could probably pull some strings with human resources to get your resume looked at. You cannot keep living like this. You will end up homeless by the time you are 40. It is frankly embarrassing for the family name when people ask what my little sister does for a living. My mother sighed heavily, shaking her head as if my very existence was a heavy burden she was forced to carry on her shoulders. Derek is offering you a lifeline, Gemma, she said sharply. You should thank your brother for his generosity. You dropped out of college. You have no real career path. We are just trying to make sure you do not end up on the streets. You need to stop playing around on your laptop and get a real job with benefits. The sheer disrespect hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They looked at me with varying expressions of pity, disgust, and arrogant superiority. They expected me to shrink down into my chair. They expected me to lower my eyes, mumble a pathetic apology, and accept their humiliation, just like I had done when I was a vulnerable teenager living under their roof. But I was not a teenager anymore. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not try to defend my life choices or explain the grueling 80-hour weeks I had spent building my software architecture from the ground up over the last decade. I slowly picked up my wine glass, taking a deliberate, unhurried sip of the expensive Cabernet. I looked directly into my father's eyes, then shifted my cold gaze to Derek, and finally to Sienna. I set the glass down. The crystal made a soft, sharp clink against the table. 42.5 million, I said. My voice was completely flat. No anger, no arrogance. Just a simple, undeniable statement of fact. The dining room fell dead silent. The sound of the wind howling outside against the lakefront windows was suddenly the only noise in the room. My mother stopped halfway through taking a bite of her salad, her fork frozen in midair. Sienna stopped breathing, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over her crystal water glass. My father blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What did you just say?" My father asked, his voice losing all of its booming confidence, replaced by a hesitant, raspy whisper. "I said 42.5 million," I repeated calmly, folding my hands gracefully in my lap. "That is my life win. That is my net worth as of last Tuesday morning." For 3 long, agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Then Derek burst into loud, aggressive laughter. He slapped his hand on the table, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked around at the others, desperately trying to rally them back to his side to maintain his dominance. "You are completely delusional," Derek sneered, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "You are actually sitting here lying to our faces because you are so jealous of my promotion. $42 million. From what exactly? Your little typing gig in your studio apartment. Stop making an absolute fool of yourself, Gemma. It is pathetic and sad to watch." Sienna rolled her eyes heavily, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Honestly, Gemma, you always ruin these family dinners with your desperate need for attention," she scoffed. "Can we just move on from this fantasy? Dad, tell her to stop ruining the evening with these stupid lies." I did not argue with them. Words were entirely useless against people who had spent a lifetime committed to misunderstanding me and tearing me down. Instead, I reached into my designer purse, the same purse my mother had loudly assumed was a cheap flea market knockoff earlier that afternoon. I pulled out my phone. I opened my private banking application. The screen prompted me for biometric authentication. I held it up to my face. The lock icon spun, turned green, and the screen illuminated with the secure dashboard of my Tier 1 wealth management account. I placed the phone flat on the smooth oak surface. I placed one finger on the screen and slid it all the way across the long dining table. It glided effortlessly and stopped right in front of my father's dinner plate. "Check it yourself," I said, leaning back in my chair. My father looked down at the glowing screen as if it were a live explosive device. His hands began to tremble slightly as he reached into his crisp linen shirt pocket and pulled out his wire-rimmed reading glasses. He slipped them onto his face and leaned in closer to the device. I watched the exact moment his fabricated reality shattered into a million pieces. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale, hollow, and suddenly very old. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He just stared at the bold, undeniable numbers staring back at him. He swallowed hard, a visible lump moving in his throat. My mother leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the bright screen. "What is it, Richard?" she demanded, her voice rising in genuine panic. "What does it say on the screen?" My father slowly looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and sheer terror. He licked his dry lips and audibly choked on his own breath as he read the verified banking balance aloud to the quiet room. $42,512,890. Derek practically leaped out of his chair like he had been physically struck. "Give me that," he barked aggressively, snatching the phone from the table before my father could stop him. He glared at the screen, his eyes darting frantically across the pixels, desperate to find a glitch, a fake bank logo, a decimal point in the wrong place. But he found absolutely nothing to save his fragile ego. Instead, he saw the detailed transaction history. He saw the massive incoming wire transfer labeled with the name of one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world, the final payout for the full acquisition of my corporate logistics software company. I watched my golden boy brother break right in front of my eyes. The smug, arrogant tech vice president, who had just condescendingly offered me a minimum wage data entry job, was staring at a liquid bank balance that he could not achieve in 10 lifetimes of working his corporate desk job. The realization hit him physically. His broad shoulders slumped forward. His jaw tightened so hard I could see a thick vein pulsing furiously in his neck. He was completely outclassed, out-earned, and humiliated by the sister he had designated as the ultimate family failure. Unable to process the absolute destruction of his status, Derek did not shout. He did not apologize. He shoved his heavy dining chair back so violently it tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. He threw my phone back onto the table, turned around, and walked straight out of the dining room without saying a single word. Derek could not handle the silence. He lunged across the polished oak table, his hand shooting out like a striking snake to aggressively snatch my phone right out from under our father's nose. He gripped the device so tightly I thought his knuckles might burst through his skin. His eyes locked onto the glowing screen, desperate to find a flaw. He was hunting for a typo, a glitch, a fake banking logo, or a decimal point that would prove I was just the pathetic, lying sister he always wanted me to be. But the high-resolution display offered him no comfort. It was the official, heavily encrypted portal of the most exclusive private wealth management bank in the country. And right there, sitting at the very top of the transaction history in bold black text, was the unarguable truth. It was a massive, fully cleared wire transfer. The sender was one of the largest technology conglomerates in the world. The memo line simply read, "Final payout for full acquisition of logistics software entity." Derek stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. I sat completely still, watching the blue light of the banking app reflect in his eyes. I watched his brain try to process the mathematical reality of that number. $42,512,890. It was a sum of money he could never hope to earn, even if he worked his corporate vice president job for the next 10 lifetimes. The undeniable proof of my success was burning a hole right through his fragile ego. His smugness shattered entirely. It was not a slow transition. It was an instant, catastrophic collapse of his entire worldview. The confident, arrogant man who had spent the last hour bragging about a shiny new Porsche and a corner office suddenly looked small, pale, and utterly defeated. His jaw trembled slightly, but no words came out. He could not hurl an insult at me, because the money shielded me from his typical attacks. He could not call me a failure, a loser, or a disappointment ever again. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had been completely eclipsed by the family scapegoat. He had been outsmarted and out-earned by the sister he had mocked for dropping out of college. Unable to cope with the suffocating weight of his own humiliation, Derek made the only move he had left. He retreated. He threw my phone back onto the center of the dining table. It landed with a loud, sharp thud that echoed in the quiet room. He stood up abruptly, shoving his heavy wooden chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed against the hardwood floor. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at our parents. He turned his back on all of us and marched straight out of the dining room. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway, followed by the aggressive slam of the front door. He left without uttering a single word. The room fell into a heavy, stunned silence after the front door slammed. My sister Sienna sat frozen, staring blankly at the overturned chair on the floor. Simone, Derek's wife, slowly picked up her wineglass, her expression unreadable as she processed her husband's cowardly exit. But it was my father, Richard, who broke the tension. I watched a fascinating transformation wash over his aging face. The absolute shock of losing his golden boy vanished in the blink of an eye. The confusion and the anger melted away, replaced instantly by something much darker and far more predictable. Greed. Pure, unadulterated greed. His posture changed. He sat up straighter, pushing his shoulders back as a wide, hungry smile spread across his face. He looked at my phone sitting on the table, and then he looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with a feverish, desperate excitement. He completely ignored the fact that his son had just stormed out of the house in a fit of jealous rage. He ignored the decade of emotional abuse they had all put me through. Instead, he brought his hands together and clapped loudly, rubbing his palms together as if he had just won the lottery himself. "Well, Gemma," he declared, his booming voice returning to its normal, arrogant volume. "This is absolutely incredible news. I always knew you had a knack for those computer things. This changes everything for us. We finally have real family capital." He leaned forward, resting his elbows confidently on the table, looking at me not as a daughter, but as a massive walking bank account. He was already spending the money in his head. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, calculating how he could use my wealth to elevate his own social status at the country club. He expected me to be grateful for his sudden approval. He expected me to fall right back into my assigned role, desperately handing over my hard-earned success to buy the parental love I had been denied my entire life. He assumed that my childhood trauma would make me weak, and that I would eagerly hand over everything I had built just to finally hear him say he was proud of me. But I did not smile back at him. I reached across the table, picked up my phone, and calmly slipped it back into my leather purse. I let the silence stretch out just long enough to make him deeply uncomfortable. The greedy smile slowly began to falter on his face. I folded my hands together, resting them gently on my lap, and looked at him with absolutely zero emotion. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the room like a steel blade. I established my first ironclad boundary of the evening. "There is no we," I said coldly, maintaining direct eye contact. "It is my money, and it always will be." My father leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, his greedy smile vanishing the second I established my firm boundary. He opened his mouth to argue, but my mother, Brenda, quickly stepped in. At 60 years old, my mother was an absolute master of emotional manipulation. She had spent my childhood perfecting the dark art of the familial guilt trip. Seeing that my father failed to intimidate me into handing over my newly acquired wealth, she decided to pivot to a different strategy. She leaned forward, reaching across the polished oak table, attempting to place her perfectly manicured hand over mine. I saw the fake warmth in her eyes and immediately pulled my hand away, folding it safely in my lap. She let out a dramatic sigh, pulling her face into an expression of deep maternal disappointment. She looked at me with sorrowful eyes, playing the role of the wounded mother to perfection. She wanted to make me feel like an ungrateful daughter in front of everyone. "Gemma, honey," she started, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. "I cannot believe you would speak to your father that way after everything we have sacrificed for you. We are your family. We stood by you when you were throwing your life away." She sat up straighter, adjusting her pearl necklace to buy herself a moment of dramatic pause. When you decided to completely embarrass this family and drop out of college, we did not turn our backs on you. We could have kicked you to the curb, but we generously kept a roof over your head. We supported you when you had nothing going for you. And now that you have finally found a little bit of success, you are going to sit there and be incredibly selfish. You are going to hoard all of this money for yourself while your own flesh and blood sits right here. It breaks my heart to see how greedy and cold you have become. You owe us, Gemma. You owe this family for the foundation we provided you when you were nothing but a failure. She looked around the table, trying to garner sympathy from my sister Sienna and my father. They both nodded in agreement, playing right into her twisted narrative. 10 years ago, her harsh words would have broken me. When I was a vulnerable 19-year-old girl trying to figure out my path, I used to internalize every single piece of criticism she threw my way. I cried myself to sleep wondering why my mother despised me while she constantly praised Derek and Sienna. But sitting at that luxury dining table with $42 million sitting safely in my private bank account, her words sounded entirely hollow. They were desperate attempts to control a woman who outgrew her cage. I did not feel the familiar sting of tears. I did not feel the urge to scream or defend my character. I just felt a profound sense of clarity. She had just handed me the perfect opportunity to expose her completely fabricated version of history. I took a slow sip of water looking at her. I let her sit in the heavy silence for a moment, allowing her false sense of victory to settle over her. She genuinely believed she backed me into a corner with her guilt trip. I set my glass down and leaned forward, mirroring her exact posture. "You kept a roof over my head," I asked, my voice completely calm and devoid of emotion. "Are you referring to the time when I was 19 years old and trying to build my first software prototype while working 3 part-time jobs just to survive? Let us get the facts straight, Mother. You did not generously keep a roof over my head. You charged me $1,200 a month to sleep in my own childhood bedroom. You treated me like a desperate tenant rather than a daughter." My mother opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. "I am not finished," I said coldly. "Do you remember what happened in November of that year? Do you remember when I was rushed to the emergency room because my appendix burst in the middle of the night? I spent 4 days in the hospital recovering from emergency surgery. The medical bills wiped out my meager savings. When rent was due on the first of the month, I handed you $1,150. I was exactly $50 short. I begged you for 3 extra days to pick up an extra shift at the diner so I could pay you the remaining $50. I kept my eyes locked on hers, refusing to let her look away from the ugly truth. "Do you want to tell the table what you did next?" I asked. My mother stared at me, her face turning pale. She could not speak, so I answered for her. "I came home from the hospital with stitches still fresh in my abdomen to find my belongings packed into black plastic trash bags and tossed onto the front lawn in the pouring rain. You locked the front door and refused to answer my phone calls over $50. I had to sleep in my rusted-out car for 2 weeks in the freezing cold while recovering from major surgery. That is your version of family support. That is the foundation you provided me. You did not save me, Mother. I survived in spite of you." The entire dining room went deathly quiet. My sister stared at her water glass, unable to make eye contact. My father suddenly found the wood grain of the table incredibly fascinating. My mother slumped back in her chair, the fake sorrow wiped from her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The cold, hard facts of her own cruelty had silenced her completely. The dining room remained wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence for several long moments. My mother stared blankly at her lap, her previous theatrical performance completely destroyed by the undeniable facts of my past trauma. My father refused to look in my direction, pretending to be fascinated by the expensive wooden table. They both tried to manipulate me and failed miserably. The delusion in my family ran incredibly deep. Just when I thought their sheer embarrassment would finally end the ridiculous demands, my older sister Sienna decided it was her turn to step into the ring. At 34 years old, Sienna had spent her entire life believing she was the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, simply because she possessed a medical degree. She never faced a consequence for her arrogance, because my parents worshipped the ground she walked on. Sienna pushed her chair back slightly, crossing her long legs and folding her arms tightly over her chest. She looked at me with an expression of pure disgust. She did not see a successful younger sister who secured her financial future through years of grueling hard work. She saw a walking ATM that was malfunctioning and refusing to dispense cash. She let out a sharp, condescending sigh, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. "You know, Gemma," she began, her voice carrying that familiar high-pitched tone of extreme entitlement. "You have always had a massive chip on your shoulder. Mom and Dad made one mistake over a decade ago, and you are still holding on to it like a petty child. You sit here acting like you are better than all of us just because you got incredibly lucky on a computer. But let us be completely honest with ourselves for a second. You did not actually earn that money through real work. You typed a bunch of code in your dark apartment and somehow tricked a tech company into buying it. It was pure dumb luck." She uncrossed her arms and leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. Her eyes narrowed as she stared me down. "I, on the other hand, actually contribute to society." She continued, her voice rising in volume and intensity. "I am a licensed cosmetic surgeon. I went through years of grueling medical school and brutal residency programs. I literally hold people's lives in my hands every single day. I am a doctor, Gemma. I am the one carrying the prestige of this family name. Because of the massive sacrifices I made to become a doctor, I am sitting on $450,000 in medical school debt. It is completely suffocating my ability to expand my private clinic." I sat there listening, completely fascinated by the audacity tumbling out of her mouth. She did not ask how my business was doing. She did not congratulate me on the acquisition. She went straight for my bank account. "So here is what is going to happen," Sienna declared, speaking to me as if I were a disobedient dog. "You are going to pay off my student loans immediately. First thing on Monday morning, you are going to wire $450,000 to my financial institution. For you, that money is basically pocket change now. You will not even notice it is gone. But for me, it is the difference between struggling to pay overhead costs and opening a second location in Beverly Hills. You are going to do this because it is your absolute familial obligation. I am your older sister doing the real important work in this world. You owe it to me to ensure my success is not hindered." My father suddenly perked up at Sienna's ridiculous demand. He nodded vigorously, his eyes shining with renewed greedy hope. "Yes, absolutely," he chimed in, his voice trembling with excitement. "Sienna is entirely right, Gemma. This is exactly what family does. We share the wealth. Paying off her loans is the least you can do to make up for the stress you caused when you dropped out." I slowly turned my head to look at my father, and then back to my sister. The entitlement radiating from them was practically toxic. Sienna sat there expecting me to immediately transfer hundreds of thousands of dollars into her account just because she demanded it. She genuinely believed that her status as a doctor made her inherently superior to me. She believed my success was completely illegitimate while hers was sacred. She framed her demand not as a polite request, but as a mandatory tax I had to pay for breathing her air. "You want me to pay off $450,000 of your medical school debt?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly calm. "Yes," Sienna snapped back, her eyes flashing with irritation that I was even questioning her. "And I do not want any sarcastic pushback. I save lives, Gemma. I am an essential pillar of the medical community. You just got lucky with an internet application. Do not make me beg for money you do not even deserve to have. You need to do the right thing and support your sister." I picked up my crystal water glass and took another slow, deliberate sip. The cool water washed down my throat as I formulated my response. I did not feel angry. I did not feel insulted by her desperate attempt to diminish my work. I actually felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Sienna proudly presented herself as an untouchable medical god, managing a prestigious career. She weaponized her status as a surgeon to justify robbing me blind. She thought she held all the winning cards in this conversation. She had absolutely no idea I spent the last 3 months thoroughly investigating the actual state of her medical career. She had no idea I knew exactly why she was so desperate for money. I slowly set my glass down, preparing to completely dismantle her entire reality. I looked at my sister sitting across the table with her arms crossed and her chin raised high. She genuinely believed that her ultimatum was going to force my hand. She thought the threat of losing her approval would send me running for my checkbook. I took a deep breath and let the silence stretch out for a moment before I gave her my answer. No, I said, simply keeping my voice completely level. I am not giving you a single dime, Sienna. Not today and not ever. Sienna gasped, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She slammed her hands flat on the wooden table, her perfectly manicured nails making a sharp clicking sound. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice echoing through the large dining room. "Did you just say no to me? I am your older sister, Gemma. I am giving you the opportunity to actually do something meaningful with your meaningless little windfall, and you have the audacity to say no. If you do not wire that money to my account by Monday morning, I will cut you out of my life permanently. You will be dead to me. You will not be invited to my wedding. You will not see your future nieces or nephews. You will be completely alone." My father immediately jumped in to support her threat. "You better think very carefully about your next words, Gemma," he warned, his face turning red with anger. "Your sister is offering you a chance to be part of this family. Do not throw it away over pure greed." I looked at my parents and then back at my sister. The sheer hypocrisy was almost laughable. They were calling me greedy while simultaneously trying to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from my bank account. I did not shed a tear at her threat of cutting me off. Actually, I found the prospect of never speaking to her again incredibly peaceful, but I was not going to let her walk away thinking she held the moral high ground. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I had spent the last 3 months working with a private investigator to look into the financials of my family members. I knew this day would come, and I wanted to be fully prepared. I placed the envelope on the table and slowly unwrapped the string closure. "You know, Sienna," I started, keeping my eyes locked on hers, "it is really fascinating how you present yourself as this untouchable medical goddess. You sit here and belittle my career while demanding I pay off your student loans. But we both know that $450,000 is not for your medical school debt, is it?" Sienna suddenly froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden flash of genuine panic. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice suddenly losing its aggressive edge. "Stop changing the subject, Gemma." I pulled out the first stack of legal documents and slid them across the table toward my father. "I am talking about the massive malpractice lawsuits currently destroying your private clinic," I said loudly, making sure every single person in the room heard me clearly. "Let us talk about a woman named Rebecca Miller. According to the public court filings from last October, Rebecca went into your clinic for a routine facial reconstruction. But because you were rushing to get to a luxury gala, you completely botched the procedure, causing permanent nerve damage to the left side of her face. She is currently suing you for $2 million in damages." My mother gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. "Richard, what is she talking about?" my mother cried out, looking frantically between me and Sienna. Sienna opened her mouth to speak, but she was trembling so hard she could not form a single word. The facade of the perfect, flawless surgeon was cracking right in front of their eyes. But I was not finished. I pulled out the second stack of papers and dropped them heavily onto the oak table. "And then there is the case of David Thompson," I continued, my voice echoing with cold authority. "3 months ago, he filed a massive lawsuit against your clinic for severe medical negligence. You failed to properly sterilize your surgical equipment, leading to a massive infection that put him in the intensive care unit for 3 weeks. His legal team is demanding a settlement of $1.5 million, and they are actively petitioning the state medical board to revoke your surgical license. You are not a successful doctor, Sienna. You are a walking liability. You are drowning in legal fees and your clinic is completely bankrupt. You did not ask me for $450,000 to pay off student loans. You wanted my money to secretly pay off your malpractice settlement before the state revokes your license and sends you to prison for criminal negligence. The heavy silence that followed my revelation was incredibly satisfying. My sister slumped back in her chair, looking like a deflated balloon. The confident, demanding surgeon was completely gone, replaced by a terrified woman facing absolute financial ruin. My father stared at the legal documents scattered across the table, his hands trembling as he read the horrific details of his perfect daughter's massive failures. My mother began to cry softly, finally realizing that her golden child was nothing but a fraud. Sienna looked up at me, her eyes swimming with tears. She opened her mouth trying to formulate a lie or an excuse, but there was nothing she could say to defend herself against the cold, hard facts. I sat there watching her entire world collapse, and I felt zero sympathy for her. She had built her entire life on a foundation of lies and pure arrogance. I smiled calmly, picked up my crystal glass, and took another sip of fresh cold water. I watched my sister Sienna completely crumble under the weight of her own exposed lies. My parents were paralyzed by the shock of the malpractice lawsuits. I thought the worst of the evening was finally over, and that they would finally leave me alone. But the universe had one more test for me. The heavy wooden door to the dining room suddenly swung wide open. Derek marched back into the room, but he was no longer alone, and he no longer looked defeated. His face was flushed with a new kind of arrogant confidence. He had retreated only to fetch his ultimate weapon. Trailing right behind him, stepping into the dining room with the cold, calculated presence of an apex predator, was his wife Simone. At 35 years old, Simone was a striking, brilliant black woman who had clawed her way to the top of the corporate legal ladder. She was a high-powered corporate attorney who specialized in aggressive mergers and acquisitions. Usually she stayed entirely out of the petty drama of my family, preferring to watch from the sidelines with a polite, detached smile. But tonight, Derek had clearly fed her a fabricated story in the hallway, convincing her to step into the ring on his behalf. She was no longer wearing the polite smile of a sister-in-law. She had flipped a switch. She was fully in litigation mode. She walked toward the table, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, demanding the absolute attention of everyone in the room. My father looked up, his eyes wide with renewed hope, seeing his daughter-in-law stepping in to save their sinking ship. Derek pulled out a chair for Simone, but she did not sit down. She stood at the head of the table directly across from me, resting her hands flat on the polished oak. She looked at me not as a family member, but as a hostile witness on the stand. "Gemma," she began, her voice smooth, incredibly calm and dripping with professional condescension. "Derek and I just had a very long, very illuminating conversation out in the hallway regarding your sudden financial windfall. It seems there has been a significant misunderstanding tonight about the legal ownership of your recently acquired logistics software company. You have been speaking to your family with an unacceptable level of disrespect, operating under the false assumption that this $42.5 million belongs exclusively to you." She paused, letting her words hang in the heavy air. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs, maintaining steady eye contact. I did not interrupt her. I wanted to hear exactly how far they were willing to take this absolute delusion. Simone reached across the table and picked up a crisp white linen napkin. She then pulled a sleek silver fountain pen from her tailored blazer pocket. With deliberate, precise movements, she uncapped the pen and began to draw directly onto the expensive linen right in front of my father. She drew a large circle and then divided it into precise slices. She was literally drawing a pie chart of my money. "This is the total valuation of the acquisition payout," she explained, tapping the center of the circle with the tip of her pen. "Now, in the corporate legal world, we deal with facts and contractual obligations, not emotions. When a founder builds a company, the allocation of equity is determined by the initial capital and the resources provided at the time of inception. You claim that you built this company from the ground up entirely by yourself. But that is simply not the factual truth, is it, Gemma? You had significant help from this family. I tilted my head slightly, waiting for the ridiculous punchline. Simone looked at Derek, who gave her a smug, encouraging nod. 10 years ago, when you dropped out of college and started writing the first lines of code for your prototype, you were living under this family roof. Simone continued, her voice rising with authoritative certainty. More importantly, my husband has informed me that you did not even own a functioning computer at the time. You built the entire foundation of your software architecture using a Dell laptop that belonged to your father, Richard, a laptop that was purchased with family funds. Therefore, from a strictly legal standpoint, the intellectual property you created was generated using family-owned hardware while you were being subsidized by their housing. This establishes a very clear, very undeniable precedent for sweat equity and shared intellectual property. My father gasped in absolute delight, his hands trembling as he realized what Simone was suggesting. Exactly, he shouted, pointing a finger at me. That was my laptop. I bought that computer for the home office. It was my property. Simone held up her hand, silencing my father so she could deliver the final devastating blow. Under the doctrines of intellectual property law and asset misappropriation, your father is a silent foundational investor in your enterprise. Simone declared, her tone turning icy and threatening. Without his hardware, your software would literally not exist. Derek and I have consulted, and we estimate that the family estate is legally entitled to a minimum of 40% of the total acquisition payout. That is $17 million, Gemma. And because Derek is the executor of the family trust and the primary financial manager for your parents, that money will be placed directly under his operational control. Simone crossed her arms, looking incredibly proud of the legal ambush she had just executed. My mother suddenly stopped crying and sat up straight, a greedy smile returning to her face. Sienna wiped her tears, nodding along, as if this insane legal theory made perfect sense. They actually believed they had found a loophole to steal my wealth. Simone genuinely believed she had backed me into an inescapable corner, using corporate jargon and sheer intimidation tactics. She thought I was just a naive computer programmer who would panic at the mention of lawsuits and intellectual property claims. She expected me to burst into tears and beg them not to take my life's work. She expected me to surrender to her superior legal knowledge and write them a massive check just to avoid going to court. I looked around the table at my family. They looked like a pack of starving wolves staring at a piece of meat. Derek was smirking at me, clearly thinking he had outsmarted me by sending his brilliant wife to do his dirty work. But they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that I spent the last 10 years swimming with corporate sharks who were far more vicious than Simone could ever hope to be. I did not panic. I did not even blink. I just smiled. Simone tapped the silver tip of her fountain pen against the linen napkin, making a sharp, rhythmic sound that demanded absolute submission. She was treating this family dinner like a high-stakes corporate boardroom negotiation, and she clearly thought she held all the winning cards. "Let me be perfectly clear about how this will proceed, Gemma," she said, dropping her voice to convey absolute authority. "First thing on Monday morning, I'm going to march right into the federal courthouse and file a temporary restraining order and an emergency injunction against your personal and business banking accounts. I will freeze every single penny of that $42.5 million before you even have a chance to buy a cup of coffee. You will not be able to transfer funds, pay off debts, or hide a single dime in an offshore account. We will tie you up in aggressive litigation for the next decade if we have to. The courts do not look kindly on ungrateful children who try to steal intellectual property from their own parents. We will drain you dry with legal fees until you beg us to settle for the $17 million we rightfully demand." My father practically swooned at the sound of the word injunction. He looked at Simone as if she were an angel handing him a golden ticket to the country club elite. He nodded vigorously, his eyes gleaming with a renewed sense of arrogant power. "That is exactly right," Richard crowed, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "You thought you could pull a fast one on this family, but you forgot that Derek married a legal genius. You are completely outmatched, Gemma." My mother Brenda clapped her hands together in giddy excitement, completely forgetting her previous role as a heartbroken mother. Even my sister Sienna, wiping away tears from her exposed malpractice lawsuits, managed a cruel smirk. Derek stood behind his wife, crossing his arms, looking incredibly proud of himself for unleashing his corporate attorney wife on his sister. They all looked at me, waiting for the panic to set in. They expected my hands to shake. They expected me to start crying and pleading for mercy. They wanted me to surrender and write a massive check just to avoid a terrifying court battle. But I did not panic. I did not feel a single drop of fear. In fact, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. I looked at the napkin with the ridiculous pie chart drawn on it, and then I looked up at Simone. She was a brilliant woman, but her fatal flaw was her blinding arrogance. She let her husband manipulate her into fighting a battle without doing her due diligence. I decided to lean right into the trap she thought she was setting for me. I shifted my posture, uncrossing my legs, and leaning forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. I maintained a very polite, very pleasant expression on my face. "You know, Simone," I began, keeping my voice soft and respectful, "I have to admit, I am genuinely impressed. You clearly know your way around corporate asset litigation. Derek always bragged about how successful you are, but seeing you in action is something else. You speak with such absolute certainty. It takes a very specific kind of training to execute a threat like that with such flawless precision. Tell me, Simone, where exactly do you practice law? What firm is lucky enough to have such a ruthless and dedicated attorney on their payroll?" Simone puffed out her chest, taking the bait with embarrassing eagerness. The polite flattery stroked her massive ego perfectly. She genuinely believed I was waving a white flag and acknowledging her absolute superiority. She offered me a condescending smile. "I am a partner at Montgomery and Pierce," she announced, her voice dripping with elitism. "We are not some local strip mall law office, Gemma. We are one of the most prestigious corporate litigation firms on the West Coast. We handle billion-dollar mergers, hostile takeovers, and complex intellectual property disputes for the most powerful technology conglomerates in the world. My billable rate is $1,200 an hour, and I have never lost a case regarding foundational asset misappropriation. When I file this injunction on Monday morning, the judge will rubber stamp it immediately because Montgomery and Pierce carries absolute weight in the legal community. You are not just fighting me, Gemma. You are fighting an army of the sharpest legal minds in the country. Do yourself a favor and agree to the settlement now before I ruin your life completely." I let her finish her magnificent speech. I let the name of her prestigious law firm hang in the quiet room for a few seconds. Montgomery and Pierce. It was an impressive name. It was also the exact name I was hoping she would say. The small, polite smile on my face grew into a sharp grin. I did not say a word as I calmly reached down beside my chair. I unclasped the gold hardware on my designer leather bag, the bag they thought was a cheap imitation. I reached inside and my fingers brushed against a crisp piece of paper I printed out 3 days ago. I knew Derek would bring Simone to the reunion. I knew she was an attorney at Montgomery and Pierce, and I knew exactly how to use her own hubris against her. I pulled the single sheet of paper out of my bag. It was a printed email correspondence. It was not a legal brief or a threatening letter. It was simply a very polite, highly confidential email from a very important person. I kept my smile firmly in place as I placed the document face down on the dining table, right next to her ridiculous linen napkin pie chart. I smoothed out the edges of the paper, preparing to completely obliterate her entire professional career. I kept my smile in place as I looked down at the paper resting on the table. The dining room was dead silent, waiting for me to make my next move. My father vibrated with greedy anticipation in his chair. My mother looked smug, convinced they had finally cornered me. Derek stood confident that he had secured a massive $17 million payday, And Simone stood directly across from me with her chest puffed out, completely blinded by her own professional arrogance. She genuinely believed dropping the prestigious name of Montgomery and Pierce was the ultimate legal checkmate. She thought the mere mention of her highly exclusive law firm would make me tremble in absolute fear and surrender my life savings without a fight. Instead, I placed my index finger in the center of the crisp white page. With a slow and deliberate motion, I slid the paper across the smooth oak surface. It glided past the crystal water glasses and stopped right next to the white linen napkin where she had drawn her ridiculous pie chart. I did not say a single word to her. I simply gestured with my eyes for her to pick it up and read it. Simone let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes, as if I were wasting her incredibly valuable billable time. She reached down with one perfectly manicured hand and picked up the document, expecting it to be some useless internet printout or a pathetic plea for mercy. I watched her eyes scan the top of the page and saw the exact second her fabricated reality fractured. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden chilling wave of panic. The document she held was not a meaningless internet article or a fake legal brief. It was printed on the heavily watermarked official digital letterhead of Montgomery and Pierce. More importantly, she recognized the name of the sender immediately. It was an email sent directly from the desk of the senior managing partner of her entire firm. This was the powerful man who owned her office building, the man who signed her massive corporate paychecks, and the man who held absolute power over her legal career. Simone gripped the edges of the paper so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white under the dining room lights. Her eyes darted back and forth across the short paragraphs, reading the precise words over and over again, as if she could force the text to change. But the text was undeniably clear and devastatingly real. The printed email was a deeply respectful, highly confidential welcome letter addressed directly to me. It formally outlined the final terms of a massive corporate retainer agreement. It detailed how my newly acquired wealth management entity was officially retaining Montgomery and Pierce for exclusive financial representation. I let her read the entire page in absolute suffocating silence, ensuring she fully digested every devastating detail. The email explicitly named me as a top-tier priority VIP client for the entire legal organization. It stated clearly that the senior managing partner himself would be personally overseeing all of my corporate asset management mergers and future acquisitions. It specifically highlighted the multi-million-dollar retainer fee I had wired directly into their corporate trust account just 3 days prior. I had not simply hired a random lawyer to look over standard contracts. I had effectively purchased the undivided attention and absolute loyalty of the most powerful legal partners at her firm. Simone slowly lowered the paper to the table, her hands shaking visibly now. She looked up at me, and the confident, high-powered corporate attorney was completely gone. She looked absolutely terrified. Her mouth opened slightly, but she could not formulate a single coherent word. She was paralyzed by the catastrophic realization of what she had just done. She had just spent the last 10 minutes aggressively threatening to sue her own firm's most valuable new client. Derek, oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated in his wife's hands, leaned forward with a greedy, disgusting grin. "What is it, Simone?" he asked eagerly. "Did she print out some fake contract to try and scare us out of our money?" Simone did not answer him at all. She could not even bring herself to look at his face. I decided to put her out of her misery and deliver the final crushing blow to her massive ego. I leaned forward, resting my arms comfortably on the heavy wooden table, and looked Simone dead in the eye. "Your boss works for me," I said, my voice low, smooth, and completely devoid of any warmth or emotion. "That multi-million-dollar retainer sitting comfortably in your corporate trust account came directly from my personal bank. I am the VIP client your senior partners have been bending over backward to please all week long. You just stood in front of my entire family and aggressively threatened to file a hostile injunction against my personal banking assets. You actively tried to weaponize your entire firm against me to steal $17 million for your greedy husband based on the absurd premise of a $200 Dell laptop. I paused, letting the sheer terrifying gravity of her legal situation sink deep into her bones. The color had completely drained from her face. If you walk into a federal courthouse on Monday morning and attempt to file a frivolous lawsuit against me, I will make one phone call to the senior managing partner. I continued, my tone turning incredibly sharp and entirely unforgiving. I will inform him that you are trying to extort his most valuable corporate client. I will have you fired for a catastrophic conflict of interest before you even finish your morning coffee. And then I will personally ensure you are permanently disbarred from practicing law anywhere in this country. You will lose your impressive career, your stellar reputation, and your entire livelihood over this. Do you understand me? And Simone stood completely frozen at the head of the dining table, her eyes locked onto the printed email. She read the words a second time, and then a third time, as if hoping the text would magically rearrange itself into something less catastrophic. But the stark reality of the situation was absolute. As a razor-sharp corporate attorney, Simone possessed a brilliant, analytical mind. She processed information at lightning speed, and right now her brain was rapidly connecting the dots of her husband's massive deception. Derek had spent their entire marriage painting me as the ultimate family failure. He had convinced her that I was a pathetic college dropout living in a miserable studio apartment, desperately clinging to a worthless internet project. He had explicitly told her earlier that evening that I was just a naive amateur who had stumbled into a minor financial fluke. He had manipulated her using her own legal expertise as a weapon to bully me into handing over $17 million. But looking at the multi-million-dollar retainer agreement signed by her own senior managing partner, Simone realized she had been played for an absolute fool. She did not see a pathetic loser sitting across from her anymore. She saw a highly calculated apex predator who had just successfully lured her into a lethal corporate trap. Simone was a shark in the legal world, and above all else she respected power, money, and the law. She recognized instantly that I held all three of those things in the palm of my hand. I was not just a wealthy woman. I was the financial lifeblood of her elite law firm. I held the power to destroy her entire professional reputation with a single phone call on Monday morning. And Simone was absolutely not going to sacrifice her hard-earned career to subsidize her husband's pathetic, bruised ego. The transformation in her demeanor was instantaneous and entirely ruthless. She did not cry or crumble under the pressure. Instead, she went into absolute self-preservation mode. She slowly released her death grip on the printed email, letting it flutter gently back down onto the polished oak table. Then she reached over and picked up the crisp white linen napkin where she had so arrogantly drawn her pie chart of my money. With a look of pure disgust, she crumpled the napkin into a tight ball and dropped it next to her untouched crystal water glass. The sound of the heavy linen hitting the wood echoed in the dead silent room. Simone slowly turned her head to look at Derek. The loving, supportive expression of a loyal wife had been completely erased from her face. She glared at him with an intensity that could freeze boiling water. Derek was still standing there with that stupid, greedy smirk on his face, completely oblivious to the fact that his legal attack dog had just been completely neutralized. He actually took a step toward her, expecting her to launch another aggressive verbal assault against me. "What is the matter, Simone?" he asked, his voice laced with arrogant confusion. "Tell her that a fake email is not going to stop us from taking what is rightfully ours." Simone looked at him as if he were a disgusting insect she had just found crawling on her designer shoes. "You lied to me, Derek," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that carried across the entire room. "You stood in the hallway and looked me dead in the eyes, and you lied to my face. You told me she was a low-level programmer who stole your father's hardware. You told me this was a simple case of family asset recovery. You failed to mention that your sister is the founder of a highly sophisticated corporate entity. You failed to mention that she is currently the most heavily guarded VIP client at my own law firm. Derek blinked rapidly, his arrogant smirk finally faltering. What are you talking about? He stammered, taking a step back from his wife. She is just trying to trick you. It is a bluff. It is not a bluff, you absolute idiot. Simone snapped, her voice raising in volume. That is the signature of my senior managing partner. You just used me to try and extort my own client. You almost cost me my license to practice law because you are too insecure to handle the fact that your little sister is vastly more successful than you will ever be. Simone turned her attention back to me. She straightened her tailored blazer, adjusting her posture to convey absolute professional submission. She knew exactly who held the power in this room. Gemma, she said, maintaining direct eye contact, her tone completely stripped of its previous condescension. I am speaking to you now not as your sister-in-law, but as an officer of the court. I formally withdraw all statements regarding intellectual property claims. I withdraw all threats of injunctions or restraining orders against your assets. There will be absolutely no lawsuit filed against you. I apologize for the unprofessional manner in which I approached you tonight. I was operating under deliberately falsified information provided to me by your brother. With her formal apology delivered, Simone physically took 3 large steps backward, distancing herself entirely from the table and from the family. She crossed her arms and stood near the doorway, effectively removing herself from the battlefield. She had switched sides without a single moment's hesitation. By withdrawing her legal expertise and her aggressive support, she completely pulled the rug out from under Derek permanently. He was left standing completely alone at the edge of the table, entirely exposed and completely defenseless. His brilliant corporate attorney wife had just bowed down to me, abandoning him to face the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. I looked at Derek, watching the sheer panic finally wash over his face. He had absolutely no weapons left to fight me. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Simone, leaving a suffocating vacuum of silence in the dining room. Derek stood completely frozen near the head of the table, looking like a terrified child who had just lost his only shield. He stared at the empty space where his brilliant corporate attorney wife had just been standing, his mind completely unable to process the magnitude of her abandonment. He had brought her in as the ultimate weapon to intimidate me, and instead she had completely disarmed him before walking out the door. Sienna was still slumped in her chair, quietly sobbing into her hands, her perfect cosmetic surgeon facade entirely destroyed by the exposure of her malpractice lawsuits. My mother, Brenda, sat completely motionless, staring blankly at her half-eaten plate of catered food, the reality of our shifted power dynamics paralyzing her. But it was my father, Richard, who completely lost his grip on reality. For my entire life, he had been the untouchable patriarch of the family, the man who dictated our worth based on his own twisted standards of success. He had orchestrated this entire evening to stroke his own ego and to put me back in my place as the family failure. Now his golden boy was exposed as a fraud, his perfect daughter was facing prison time, and his terrifying legal threat had evaporated into thin air. I watched the physical transformation take over his body. The arrogant, puffed-out chest collapsed entirely. His broad shoulders hunched forward, and his face turned a pale, sickly shade of gray under the warm chandelier lights. He looked wildly around the room, searching for another lie to tell, another manipulation to use, or another weapon to hurl at me. But there was absolutely nothing left. The fortress of lies he had built around this family had been completely leveled to the ground. Richard suddenly gripped the edges of the heavy wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white. A strange choking sound escaped his throat. It was not a cough, but a genuine sob of sheer panic. Then the untouchable patriarch completely broke down. He did not just cry, he began to scream. His voice cracked, echoing off the high ceilings of the luxury rental cabin as the ugly, absolute truth finally spilled out of his mouth. "We have absolutely nothing left," he shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound despair. "We are completely ruined, Gemma. The money is gone. All of it is gone." My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands, but my father ignored her entirely, keeping his desperate, tear-filled eyes locked directly on me. "You sit there, judging us for asking for money, but you have no idea what it takes to keep this family afloat," he yelled, pounding his fist against the table. "I have spent the last 5 years drowning in debt to maintain our image." Do you think Derek bought that Porsche with his own money? Do you think his vice president's salary covers his ridiculous country club memberships and his luxury vacations? I paid for all of it. I took out a second mortgage on the family home just to fund his pathetic lifestyle so he could look like a success. And Sienna, her private clinic has been hemorrhaging money since the day she opened the doors. I drained my entire retirement savings and took out high-interest personal loans to keep her afloat and pay her legal retainer fees so she would not lose her medical license. I sacrificed everything I had to make sure your brother and sister looked perfect to the outside world, and now there is nothing left to give. He paused, gasping for air, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. The bank called me on Thursday morning, Gemma. They are completely foreclosing on the family home. They are changing the locks and kicking us out into the street in exactly 72 hours. The sheer pathetic nature of his confession hung in the air. The truth was finally out in the open. They were not a wealthy, successful family looking down on me. They were completely bankrupt, drowning in a sea of their own financial incompetence and toxic pride. My father wiped his face with a trembling hand, his voice dropping to a pathetic, begging whisper. "We did not rent this luxury cabin to celebrate a family reunion," he confessed, looking down at his lap in utter shame. "We could not even afford the deposit. Derek put it on a high-interest credit card that is about to default. We brought you here because we knew you were saving money from your software business. We planned this entire weekend as a highly calculated trap to pressure you into taking out a $50,000 personal loan for us. We just needed enough cash to stop the bank foreclosure and buy ourselves another single month. But now we know you have $42 million sitting quietly in your account. You can save us, Gemma. You can pay off the mortgages and fix all of this right now. You have the power to absolutely save this entire family from complete financial destruction." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with desperate, pleading hope, expecting me to suddenly feel a massive surge of familial duty and rescue them from their own catastrophic mistakes. I looked at the man who had mocked my dreams, belittled my hard work, and treated me like absolute garbage my entire life. I reached forward and very calmly picked up my crystal water glass, taking a moment to fully appreciate the beautiful irony of the situation while my family held their collective breath. I took a slow, refreshing sip of the ice-cold water, letting the heavy silence stretch out and completely suffocating his final hope. I carefully placed the glass back down onto the oak table. "Not my problem," I replied. My father buried his face in his hands, sobbing into the quiet room as the reality of my refusal washed over him. He had laid all his cards on the table, begging me to save him from his own disastrous financial choices, and I had given him the exact level of sympathy he deserved. None. But while my father was surrendering to his catastrophic defeat, my brother Derek was experiencing a very different kind of breakdown. The smug, arrogant vice president who had proudly strutted into this dining room an hour ago was now a cornered animal. His wife had abandoned him, his father had exposed his fake wealthy lifestyle, and his entire carefully constructed facade was lying in pieces on the hardwood floor. Derek began to pace back and forth near the large bay windows, his breathing shallow and rapid. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up completely. His face was no longer flushed with confidence but pale with a desperate, frantic terror. He was watching his luxury life slip through his fingers, and his fragile ego simply could not handle the humiliation of losing to the sister he despised. He stopped pacing abruptly and turned to face me. His eyes were wide and wild, completely devoid of reason or sanity. He reached into the inside pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket, pulling out a small silver USB drive and holding it up in the air as if it were a loaded weapon. He was shaking, but a twisted, desperate smile slowly crept across his face. "You think you have won, do you not, Gemma?" He practically spat the words out, his voice cracking with manic energy. "You think you can just sit there with your millions of dollars and watch us drown while you play the untouchable queen? Well, you are wrong. I am not going down like this. I am not going to let you walk out of here and leave me with nothing. You owe me, and I am going to make sure I get exactly what I deserve." He walked slowly back toward the table, gripping the back of his empty wooden chair. I watched him with mild fascination. I had expected him to throw a tantrum, or maybe storm out again, but I had not expected him to completely cross the line into federal criminality. Derek tossed the silver USB drive onto the polished oak table right next to my crystal water glass. "Let me tell you what is on that drive, little sister," he sneered, leaning forward so his face was just inches from mine. "A few weeks ago, when the news of your massive company acquisition first hit the industry blogs, I decided to do a little digging. I still had the administrative passwords to the family network you used when you lived here 10 years ago. It took some serious effort, but I managed to hack into the cloud storage accounts you used during the first 3 years of your startup. I downloaded every single one of your early tax records, your vendor invoices, and your preliminary corporate filings. I have all of it right here." He tapped the small metal drive with his index finger. "And let me tell you, Gemma, your early accounting was very messy. It was incredibly easy for me to manipulate a few spreadsheets and alter a handful of digital signatures. I have spent the last 2 weeks creating a perfectly fabricated paper trail that makes it look like you committed massive corporate fraud and tax evasion during the foundational years of your company. It looks completely legitimate, and it is entirely untraceable back to me." The dynamic in the dining room instantly shifted from toxic familial entitlement to outright criminal extortion. Derek was no longer asking for a loan or demanding a portion of my wealth out of some twisted sense of sibling duty. He was actively blackmailing me. "If you do not pull out your phone right now and wire $5 million into my offshore holding account, I am going to send this drive directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." He threatened, his voice dropping into a dark, menacing growl. "I will send copies to the board of directors at the tech conglomerate that just bought your company. They will freeze your $42 million payout instantly. They will drag you into federal court, and you will spend the next 5 years of your life fighting to stay out of a federal penitentiary." $5 million, Gemma. That is the price of your freedom. It is a massive discount considering how much money you just made. You wire the money tonight, and I will destroy this drive. You refuse, and I promise you I will absolutely destroy your entire life." He stood up straight, crossing his arms and looking down at me with a sickening expression of triumph. He genuinely believed he had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. He thought he had outsmarted me by resorting to a terrifying felony. He expected me to pale in fear, to reach frantically for my phone, and to transfer millions of dollars into his account to protect my hard-earned reputation. Any normal person might have been terrified by the threat of a federal investigation and a fabricated corporate scandal. But looking at my brother, I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt an overwhelming sense of cold, absolute clarity. Derek had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. He had completely miscalculated the depth of my preparation and the absolute ruthless nature of my defense. I did not move to pick up the drive. I did not reach for my phone to open my banking application. I sat there looking at the small piece of metal on the table and then up at the pathetic, desperate man who thought he could extort me. I was completely unbothered. I sat perfectly still at the dining table, looking at the small silver flash drive that my brother had just weaponized against me. In any normal family, a son pulling out a stolen hard drive and actively threatening to extort his younger sister for $5 million would be met with absolute horror. You would expect the parents to intervene, to shout at him to drop the drive, and to beg for forgiveness for raising a criminal. You would expect a mother to cry out in shock, or a father to demand his son step back from the edge of a federal felony. I waited for that reaction. I gave my parents the silent opportunity to finally do the right thing, to finally stand up for me just once in my entire 33 years of existence. I watched my father Richard and my mother Brenda very closely to see how they would process the fact that their golden boy had just proudly confessed to corporate hacking and blackmail. But the horror never came. The shock never materialized. Instead, an incredibly sickening transformation took place across my parents' faces. My father, who just moments ago was sobbing into his hands about his impending bank foreclosure, suddenly lifted his head. The pathetic, desperate tears completely vanished. He looked at the silver drive on the table, and then he looked at Derek. And then my father actually smiled. It was not a smile of relief, it was a twisted, greedy grin of sheer opportunistic joy. He saw the blackmail not as a crime, but as a brilliant negotiation tactic. He sat up straight, pushing his shoulders back and adjusting his collar as if he had just regained his position as the patriarch of the family. He cleared his throat and looked at me with an expression of absolute entitlement. "Well, Gemma," he said, his voice completely devoid of any moral compass. "It looks like your brother has offered you a very reasonable compromise. You have $42 million sitting in your bank account. $5 million is just a fraction of your overall wealth. You would barely even notice it is gone. But for this family, it means absolutely everything. It saves my house. It saves your sister's medical career. And it rewards Derek for his incredible resourcefulness. You have to admit he was very clever to secure an insurance policy like this. He is just protecting his family." I stared at him, completely fascinated by the sheer magnitude of his delusion. "You are actually encouraging him?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. "You are sitting there endorsing the fact that your son just committed a federal cybercrime and is actively trying to extort me." My father waved his hand dismissively as if I had just complained about the weather. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Gemma," he scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Nobody is extorting anybody. We are family. Families help each other out when times get tough. You are being incredibly stubborn and selfish by refusing to share your windfall with us." Derek simply found a way to level the playing field. If you had just agreed to help us in the first place, he would not have been forced to take such drastic measures. This is really your own fault for being so ungrateful. Just pull out your phone, wire the $5 million to his account right now, and we can put all of this unpleasantness behind us. We can finally have some peace in this family. Before I could even respond to my father's staggering hypocrisy, my mother decided to join the chorus of delusion. Brenda leaned forward, resting her arms on the table, and put on her best maternal performance. She softened her eyes and tilted her head, trying to look like a compassionate peacemaker instead of a willing accomplice to a felony. "Gemma, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice dripping with that familiar, sickening sweetness. "Please, just listen to your father. We do not want to see you get in trouble with the government. Federal investigations are so messy and public. It would completely ruin your reputation and your new business connections. Why would you want to risk going to prison over a few $1,000,000 when you have so much to spare?" She reached out as if to touch my hand, but I pulled it back sharply. She let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head in profound disappointment. "Derek is not a bad person," she continued, defending her golden boy without a single ounce of shame. "He is just a desperate father and a loving son, trying to keep this family from falling apart. He made a mistake hacking into your files, sure, but his heart is in the right place. He is trying to save us, Gemma. You are the one being cold and calculated. If you just pay the money right now, I promise you Derek will destroy that little metal drive and we will never speak of this again. We can go back to being a happy family. We can enjoy the rest of this beautiful vacation, and you can go home knowing you did the right thing. Just pay the $5 million, Gemma. It is a small price to pay for family peace." I looked at my mother, and then at my father. Finally, I looked at Derek, who was standing there with a smug, victorious smirk plastered across his face. He actually thought he had won. He thought his parents' blind loyalty and toxic endorsement had sealed my fate. They were all staring at me, waiting for me to break. They expected me to pull out my phone log into my banking application and hand over $5 million of my hard-earned money just to buy their silence. In that exact moment, something fundamentally shifted inside of me. Any lingering trace of daughterly obligation completely evaporated. Any tiny microscopic sliver of guilt I might have felt about what I was about to do to them vanished into thin air. For years I had wondered if maybe I was the problem. I had wondered if maybe I was too sensitive or too distant. But sitting in that luxury dining room listening to my parents eagerly endorse the criminal extortion of their youngest daughter, I finally understood the absolute truth. They were completely morally bankrupt. They were toxic parasites who would happily watch me burn to the ground as long as it kept them warm. They had made their final choice. They chose to protect the golden boy even when he was a literal criminal. They chose their own greedy comfort over my basic safety. They proved to me right then and there that they were entirely beyond redemption. They did not deserve my mercy. They fully deserved the absolute devastating punishment I was about to unleash upon them. I calmly picked up my crystal water glass, taking one final sip, preparing to destroy their entire world and walk away forever. The time for talking was now completely over, and the time for action had finally arrived. It was time to end this ridiculous game, once and for all, tonight. I sat perfectly still looking at my family members. They waited for me to break. They expected a tearful surrender. Instead, a sound escaped my throat that shattered the tense silence of the dining room. It started as a soft chuckle and grew into a full, genuine laugh. I tilted my head back and laughed loudly, echoing off the high ceiling. My father frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her heavy wooden chair. Derek lost his smug, victorious smirk instantly. His eyes darted around the room as if trying to find the joke he had somehow missed. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white once again. "What is so funny, Gemma?" He snapped, his voice pitching up in defensive anger. "You think a federal prison sentence is a joke. You think the Internal Revenue Service is just going to ignore a massive paper trail of corporate fraud." I slowly stopped laughing and wiped a single tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye. I looked at my brother and let out a long, contented sigh. "I am laughing, Derek, because you are incredibly pathetic," I said, my voice entirely calm and steady. "You actually think you can hack into a forgotten cloud storage account, manipulate a few outdated spreadsheets, and use that to extort a woman who just sold a company for $42 million. It is completely absurd. Do you have any idea what the acquisition process actually entails?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. "Do you honestly believe that a massive global tech conglomerate simply hands over $42 million without checking under the hood?" For the past 6 months, my entire company was subjected to the most rigorous, grueling financial due diligence process on the planet. I had teams of forensic accountants, elite corporate lawyers, and federal tax auditors analyzing every single penny that ever moved through my business from the very first day of its existence. They reviewed my vendor invoices, my tax filings, my employee payroll, and my personal bank accounts. They scrubbed my financial history clean and verified that my company was completely flawless. You think your little fabricated Excel documents are going to trigger a federal investigation? You are completely delusional, Derek. I reached across the table and pushed the small silver flash drive right back toward him. The metal scraped against the polished oak wood. "Go ahead," I challenged him, maintaining direct, unblinking eye contact. "Pick up your phone right now and email those files to the Internal Revenue Service. Send them to my new board of directors. Send them to the local news stations for all I care. Hit send, Derek. I dare you. Let us see what happens when the federal government traces those manipulated digital signatures right back to your personal computer IP address. You just confessed to federal cyber extortion in front of multiple witnesses. You did not trap me, Derek. You just handed me the key to lock you in a prison cell for the next 10 years. Derek stared at the tiny silver flash drive, sitting innocently in front of him on the table. The healthy color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale, sick, and terrified. He did not reach for his phone to send the email. He did not pick up the drive. His entire brilliant extortion plan had completely disintegrated into thin air before his very eyes. My father swallowed hard, the sickening, greedy hope vanishing from his aged expression entirely. My mother looked down at her lap, suddenly realizing that her precious golden boy had just proudly walked himself into a massive, inescapable legal trap. But I was not finished with him yet. Defending myself against his pathetic blackmail attempt was only the beginning of my retaliation. It was finally time to go completely on the offensive. You see, Derek, when you have the kind of immense wealth that I now have, you do not just sit around waiting for jealous, bitter family members to attack you from the shadows. I explained, my voice dropping to a smooth, calculating tone. You hire the absolute best corporate private investigators that money can buy. You pay them handsomely to look deep into the people who have been actively trying to destroy your life. And you find out exactly what kind of ugly criminal secrets they are desperately hiding behind their expensive tailored suits and their leased luxury cars. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my phone. The bright screen illuminated my face in the dim dining room lighting, casting long shadows against the walls. I unlocked the device and navigated directly to a secure, encrypted file folder. I tapped the smooth glass screen a few deliberate times, selecting a very specific, massive digital document that I had been holding on to all evening. I looked up at my family, their faces frozen in a mixture of deep confusion and growing unspoken dread. You wanted to talk about corporate fraud, Derek? I asked, my tone turning icy cold and completely unforgiving. Let us talk about corporate fraud. Let us talk about the real reason you are so incredibly desperate for $5 million tonight. I pressed the screen and activated the AirDrop feature on my phone. The luxury dining room was absolutely silent for a brief, suffocating moment. Then a sharp digital ping echoed through the quiet room. It came from my father's heavy smartphone resting on the table. A second ping followed instantly from my mother's designer purse sitting on the floor, then another crisp ping from Sienna's phone next to her plate. And finally, a loud, aggressive notification sounded from the phone sitting right in front of Derek. I had just wirelessly transferred a massive PDF file to every single active device at the long dining table. Open it, I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. My father, with badly trembling hands, picked up his phone and tapped the glowing screen to accept the incoming digital file. Sienna wiped her ruined makeup and slowly unlocked her device, staring at the loading bar. Derek just stared down at his screen, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic as he read the bold title of the incoming document. The file was extremely heavy, containing hundreds of dense pages of highly classified financial data. As the massive document slowly opened on all of their individual screens, the terrifying reality of the situation washed over the entire room like a tidal wave of cold water. It was not a fake spreadsheet hastily thrown together. It was not a manipulated tax record designed to scare a naive victim. It was a completely authentic, internal, highly classified financial audit report. The colorful logo printed at the very top of the first page was undeniably clear and impossible to misinterpret. It was the official corporate crest of the exact same mid-sized tech firm where Derek proudly claimed to be the brilliant vice president of operations. The absolute truth was finally sitting right there in the palm of their hands, completely inescapable and utterly devastating to his entire arrogant existence. I sat back in my chair and watched the glowing screens illuminate the terrified faces of my family members. The heavy silence in the dining room was broken only by the sound of my father swiping his trembling finger across his phone screen, trying to comprehend the massive document I had just sent him. Derek was completely paralyzed. He stared at his phone with his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as though he had just seen a ghost. He recognized the official corporate logo of his own technology firm immediately. He recognized the highly classified formatting of an internal executive audit, and he knew exactly what kind of damning information was buried inside those pages. My mother looked up at me, her face pale and confused, not understanding the complex financial jargon on her screen. She opened her mouth to ask a question, but I raised my hand to silence her. I wanted Derek to understand exactly how I had orchestrated his complete and absolute downfall before anyone else spoke a single word. You see, Derek. I began, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the quiet room. When you sell a software company for over $42 million, you do not just put that money into a basic savings account. You partner with elite private equity groups to diversify your assets and make strategic investments in other companies. About 2 months ago, my financial advisors brought me a very interesting portfolio. It was a mid-sized technology firm that was seeking emergency capital injections to avoid filing for bankruptcy. I recognized the name of the company immediately, because it was the exact same firm where you have been proudly bragging about being the brilliant vice president of operations. The irony was simply too perfect to ignore. So I authorized my wealth management team to quietly purchase a 15% controlling shareholder stake in your company. It cost me less than $3 million, but it gave me something entirely priceless. It gave me a permanent seat at the adult table. It made me one of the largest majority shareholders of your entire corporate organization. And as a majority shareholder, I had the absolute legal authority to demand an immediate independent forensic audit of the executive management suite. Derek let out a shallow, gasping breath, gripping the edge of the dining table, as if the floor had just dropped out from underneath him. My father, Richard, finally stopped scrolling through the document on his phone and looked up, his face twisted in sheer horror. He looked from the glowing screen to his golden boy son, finally starting to piece together the catastrophic truth. I did not give Derek a chance to formulate a lie or an excuse. I kept my eyes locked directly on him, delivering the final crushing blow with surgical precision. The independent auditors spent 4 weeks tearing apart your departmental budgets. Derek, I explained, my tone turning icy cold, and they found some incredibly fascinating discrepancies. For the past 3 years, you have not been acting as a successful corporate executive. You have been actively running a highly illegal embezzlement scheme right out of your corner office. The audit clearly details how you set up 4 fake vendor accounts and used them to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the corporate operational budget directly into your own private offshore accounts. You did not earn that shiny new Porsche sitting out in the driveway, Derek. You stole the money from your own company to buy it. The entire room gasped in unison. Sienna dropped her phone onto the table, the loud clatter breaking the heavy tension. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, tears of absolute devastation welling up in her eyes as the flawless image of her perfect son shattered into a million irreparable pieces. You stole the money to pay for your ridiculous country club memberships, your luxury vacations, and your expensive tailored suits. I continued, raising my voice to ensure every single person heard the undeniable truth. You have been bleeding your own company dry to maintain the pathetic illusion that you are a wealthy, successful man. The audit proves that you embezzled over $800,000 in corporate funds, Derek. You are not a genius vice president carrying on a legacy of excellence. You are a common thief. You are a fraud. And the absolute best part of this entire situation is that the board of directors received the finalized version of this exact same audit report yesterday afternoon. They already know everything. They know exactly how much you stole. They know exactly how you did it, and they have already handed all the evidence over to the federal authorities. Derek fell backward into his heavy wooden chair, his legs completely giving out beneath him. He looked like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs, but he could not say a single word in his own defense. The undeniable mathematical proof of his massive criminal enterprise was sitting right there on the table in front of him. My father dropped his phone, dropping his head into his hands as a loud, agonizing sob ripped through his chest. He had secretly taken out massive second mortgages and completely ruined his own financial future to support a son who was secretly stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars just to feed his own massive ego. The golden boy was completely exposed as the ultimate family failure. I sat there quietly watching the absolute destruction of my arrogant brother, and I felt a profound sense of peaceful satisfaction. He had tried to blackmail me with a fake paper trail of corporate fraud, and in response, I had completely buried him under a mountain of his own very real, very illegal financial crimes. It was finally the absolute and ultimate checkmate. While my father sobbed into his hands, and my brother Derek sat frozen in a state of absolute catatonic shock, my sister-in-law Simone remained completely still. She was standing near the doorway where she had retreated just moments before, but her eyes were glued to the bright screen of her smartphone. As a high-powered corporate attorney, Simone spent her entire life reading dense financial documents. She did not just see numbers on a page, she saw the exact legal implications of every single fraudulent transaction. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers scroll slowly down the glowing screen, her sharp eyes scanning the detailed columns of the executive audit report I had just wirelessly transferred to her device. She was reading the undeniable proof of her husband's massive embezzlement scheme. She saw the fake vendor accounts he had established. She saw the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had illegally siphoned from the corporate operational budget. She saw the digital trails leading directly to his private offshore bank accounts. Simone knew exactly what the federal sentencing guidelines were for aggravated wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. She knew that the Department of Justice did not offer lenient plea deals to arrogant mid-level executives who stole from their own shareholders to fund a luxury lifestyle. She was doing the legal math in her head, calculating the mandatory minimum prison sentence her husband was about to receive. The transformation in Simone was absolutely fascinating to witness. Any normal wife might have burst into tears, screamed in disbelief, or rushed to her husband's side to demand an explanation. But Simone was not a normal wife. She was an apex predator in the legal world, and her survival instincts were unparalleled. I watched the realization wash over her beautiful features. She did not look at Derek with heartbreak or sorrow. She looked at him as a catastrophic legal liability. She realized in that exact moment that her husband had not only lied to her about his success, but he had actively endangered her entire life. He had purchased their luxury vehicles and funded their lavish vacations using stolen corporate funds. He had exposed her pristine legal career to a massive federal investigation. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation decided to audit their joint marital assets, she could lose her law license, her partnership at Montgomery and Pierce, and everything she had worked so incredibly hard to build over the last decade. Her marriage evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. The love she might have held for the man sitting at the table completely died, replaced by a cold, calculating urge to protect herself and her assets at all costs. Simone finally looked up from her phone. She slowly locked the screen and slipped the device into her tailored blazer pocket. The dining room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the pathetic sound of my father's continuous weeping. Simone took a deliberate step back toward the heavy oak table. She did not look at my parents, and she completely ignored my sister Sienna, who was still crying quietly in her chair. Simone locked her fierce, unblinking eyes directly onto Derek. Derek looked up at her, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He swallowed hard, his eyes pleading silently for her to perform a legal miracle to find a loophole to save him from the absolute destruction I had just unleashed upon him. Instead of offering him comfort or whispering sweet words of reassurance, Simone raised her left hand. With slow, deliberate precision, she gripped the massive diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band that Derek had proudly placed on her finger 5 years ago. A ring that she now knew was likely paid for with stolen corporate money. She pulled the heavy rings off her slim finger. She did not throw them in anger. She simply extended her hand over the polished wood of the dining table and opened her fingers. The heavy diamond and platinum jewelry dropped from her hand and hit the solid oak surface with a sharp, heavy clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the desperately quiet room. Derek flinched violently at the sound of the rings hitting the table. Simone, he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate croak that sounded nothing like the confident man from an hour ago. Please, let me explain this. I can fix this mess. I can hire the best defense lawyers in the city. You have to help me fight this. Simone looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I am not going to help you, Derek, she said, her voice dropping into a smooth, terrifyingly calm register. You have committed multiple federal felonies. You have engaged in aggravated wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal tax evasion. The board of directors has already handed this devastating audit over to the federal authorities. The Department of Justice is going to indict you, and you are going to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. First thing on Monday morning, I am filing for an expedited divorce, she announced, delivering her words like a lethal injection. I am hiring the most aggressive, ruthless divorce attorney in the state of California. I am filing for full separation of all financial assets immediately. I will be taking the primary residence, the clean investment portfolios, and every single dime that I personally earned through my own hard work. I will be fully cooperating with the federal investigators to prove that I had absolutely no prior knowledge of your highly illegal activities. I will hand over every financial record they ask for to ensure my professional name is completely cleared of your pathetic, sloppy crimes. Derek reached out a trembling hand toward her, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and running down his cheeks. Simone, please, he begged, completely abandoning his arrogant golden boy persona. You are my wife. You cannot just leave me here. I will have nothing. I will have no one. You should have thought about that before you decided to steal $800,000 to buy a Porsche. Simone replied coldly. And just to be absolutely clear, Derek, do not even think about calling my law firm to ask for representation. We do not represent criminals who steal from our corporate VIP clients. Without shedding a single tear, without offering a single ounce of sympathy, Simone turned on her designer heel. She did not say goodbye to my parents. She did not say a word to me. She simply walked out of the dining room, her footsteps echoing down the long hallway. She grabbed her coat from the entryway, opened the heavy front door of the luxury Airbnb, and walked out into the cold night air. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing Derek's fate entirely. I sat perfectly still, watching the beautiful destruction of his support system. He was completely isolated. He had no money, no career, no wife, and no future. He was left sitting at the table, staring at the diamond rings resting on the wood, finally realizing that he had absolutely, completely destroyed his own life. The sound of the front door clicking shut behind Simone sent a shockwave through the remaining members of my family. Derek remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the platinum wedding band resting on the oak table. He was a broken man, consumed by the catastrophic reality of his own impending federal prison sentence. With the golden boy neutralized, and my parents drowning in the exposure of their financial ruin, the energy in the room shifted entirely. The suffocating arrogance that had filled this rental cabin all weekend was gone. In its place was nothing but raw terror. And nobody was more terrified than my older sister, Sienna. For her entire life, Sienna had comfortably hidden behind Derek and his supposed massive success. She had used his loud, aggressive bullying to mask her own deep insecurities and her catastrophic professional failures. But now her primary human shield had been obliterated right in front of her eyes. She was left exposed, forced to face the massive $2 million medical malpractice lawsuits hovering over her head without any protection. I watched Sienna stare at her older brother, unable to comprehend how quickly his entire life had just been dismantled. She slowly turned her head to look at me, and I could see the absolute panic taking over her mind. She realized that I was no longer the pathetic little sister she could easily bully into submission. I was a massive, unstoppable force, and I held the absolute power to either save her from financial ruin or let her drown in her own toxic mistakes. The flawless, arrogant cosmetic surgeon who had demanded I pay off her student loans just an hour ago suddenly vanished. Sienna let out a loud, pathetic sob. Her perfectly styled blonde hair fell into her face and her expensive waterproof mascara began to run down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She pushed her heavy wooden chair back and stood up, her legs shaking so violently she could barely support her own weight. And then, the absolute unthinkable happened. My beautiful, proud, fiercely arrogant older sister slowly sank down onto the hardwood floor. She dropped directly to her knees right in front of my chair, abandoning every single ounce of her dignity. "Gemma, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a desperate, hysterical pitch. "Please do not do this to me. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I said to you earlier tonight. I was just jealous of you. I was projecting my own failures onto you because I was so terrified of losing everything." She reached out her trembling hands, desperately trying to grab onto the hem of my skirt. But I pulled my legs back out of her reach. She let her hands fall into her lap, sobbing uncontrollably. "You have to help me, Gemma," she pleaded, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "If I do not pay those malpractice settlements by the end of the month, the state medical board is going to revoke my surgical license. I will lose my private clinic, my car, my apartment, and my entire reputation." But it is even worse than that, Gemma. The lawyers representing my patients found out that I falsified my surgical sterilization records to save money on overhead costs. They are pressing criminal charges for severe medical fraud. If I do not offer them a cash settlement to drop the criminal complaints, I am going to go to a state prison. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she laid out the pathetic reality of her impending doom. "Please, Gemma, I am begging you as your sister," she cried, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "You have $42 million. You can make all of these terrifying lawsuits disappear with a single phone call to your bank. You can save my life. I will do anything you want. I will publicly apologize to you. I will pay you back every single penny with interest. Please do not let them take my medical license and send me to jail." I sat perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic, sobbing woman kneeling on the floor in front of me. I let her desperate pleas hang in the air, allowing the sheer humiliation of her position to sink into her bones. I thought about all the years she had spent mocking me. I thought about how she had laughed at my dreams, belittled my hard work, and treated me like garbage simply because she wore a white medical coat. I searched deep inside my heart to see if I could find even a microscopic drop of sympathy for my older sister. I found nothing but cold indifference. She had built her entire medical career on a foundation of lies, arrogance, and dangerous negligence. She had disfigured her own patients just so she could rush off to luxury gala events. She deserved every single terrible consequence that was about to hit her. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer her a cruel smile. I maintained a blank expression as I reached my right hand into my expensive designer purse. I bypassed my leather wallet and my checkbook. Instead, my fingers brushed against the small, zippered coin pocket stitched into the lining. I pulled out a single, shiny silver quarter. I pulled my hand out of the purse and held the small coin between my thumb and index finger. Sienna watched my hand with desperate, wide eyes, believing for a fraction of a second that I was pulling out a pen to write her a settlement check. I lowered my hand to the polished oak table and released the coin. It hit the wood with a sharp metallic clink. I placed my index finger on the edge of the quarter and slid it across the surface of the dining table until it stopped right near the edge above her kneeling body. "Call a public defender," I said coldly. The sound of the silver quarter hitting the polished oak table echoed in the dead silent dining room. Sienna stared at the small coin resting near the edge of the wood, her tears dripping down her face and splashing onto the hardwood floor. My father Richard watched the entire exchange with wide, terrified eyes. The untouchable patriarch of our family, the proud man who had dictated our worth for over 3 decades, suddenly realized the absolute finality of my power. His perfect golden boy son was headed straight to federal prison for corporate embezzlement. His brilliant daughter was facing criminal medical fraud charges and total bankruptcy, and he was about to be thrown out into the street by the bank in exactly 72 hours. The massive inflated ego that had sustained him for his entire life completely shattered right in front of my eyes. He looked at me not as a disappointing daughter, but as his absolute last hope for survival. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He stumbled forward, grabbing the edge of the heavy dining table for support, and then slowly collapsed onto the floor right next to Sienna. The great Richard, the man who had mocked my internet typing gigs just an hour ago, was now kneeling on the rug, with tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Gemma, please!" he cried, his voice completely broken and pathetic. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. I know I made terrible mistakes in the past. I know I was far too harsh on you when you were growing up, but I was just trying to push you to be your absolute best. And look at you now. You are brilliant. You are wealthy. You proved me wrong." He reached his hand out toward me, his fingers trembling in the cold air. "You cannot let the bank take the family house. It is the very last thing we have left in this world. Where will your mother and I go? We are too old to start over with absolutely nothing. Please, Gemma, I am begging you to save your childhood home. I will do whatever you want me to do. I will transfer the deed directly into your name. Just pay off the second mortgage and stop the foreclosure proceedings. You have $42 million sitting in your bank account right now. You can fix all of this pain with a single phone call. You have to help us. Blood is thicker than water, Gemma. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood. You are our daughter, and we desperately need you." I looked down at the pathetic crying man kneeling on the floor at my feet. He actually thought he could manipulate me one last time. He genuinely thought that invoking the sacred concept of family blood would magically erase decades of severe emotional abuse, financial extortion, and cruel mockery. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I sat perfectly still in my chair, maintaining absolute emotional control. "You do not get to use the word family to trap me, Richard," I said, my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any warmth. "You do not get to invoke our shared bloodline after you sat there and cheered while your son tried to commit federal cyber extortion against me for $5 million. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly into his tear-filled, panicked eyes. "Let me make something very clear to you right now. Blood is just biology. Loyalty is a choice. And you made your choice a very long time ago. You chose Derek. You chose Sienna. You funded their lies and protected their toxic egos while you threw my belongings out into the freezing rain over $50. You chose them over me every single day of my life. So now you get to sit there and enjoy the absolute consequences of your choices." My father let out a loud, agonizing sob, burying his face deep into his trembling hands. He thought my refusal was the worst thing that could possibly happen to him tonight. He thought I was just going to politely walk away and let the bank foreclose on his house at the end of the week. But I was not just going to walk away from this situation. I was going to completely redefine his entire reality. "You see, Richard, I already knew all about your massive financial problems before I even arrived at this luxury rental cabin," I explained, my tone turning dangerously sharp and precise. "When my private equity group uncovered Derek and his massive corporate embezzlement scheme, my investigators naturally looked deep into your personal finances as well. I knew you secretly took out a second mortgage to fund his lavish lifestyle. I knew you were severely delinquent on your monthly payments. And I knew the bank was actively planning to initiate foreclosure proceedings in 72 hours. My father slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with utter confusion and a terrifying new sense of dread. "So I made a highly confidential phone call to the executive branch of your lending institution." I continued, delivering the final devastating truth. I did not pay off your massive mortgage, Richard. I bought your debt. I purchased your entire loan portfolio directly from the bank at a premium cash price. I am not going to save you from your terrible mistakes. I own your financial debt. I own the legal deed to the property. I am your new landlord. You and my mother have exactly 30 days to pack up all your belongings and vacate the premises, I added, watching the absolute horror completely wash over his pale face. If you refuse to leave, I will personally have the county sheriff physically remove you from my property. The untouchable patriarch was finally broken, and I was the one holding the hammer. My absolute victory was now entirely complete. My father remained on the floor weeping uncontrollably as the reality of his massive financial ruin fully materialized. I did not offer him a hand to help him up. Instead, I slowly stood up from my heavy wooden dining chair, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored wool coat, draped over the back of the chair. My fingers grasped a thick, folded piece of heavy legal parchment. I pulled it out and held it up under the warm glow of the chandelier. Every eye in the room suddenly locked onto the document. They looked at the folded paper with absolute sheer terror. Knowing that every single time I produced a piece of paper tonight, it had completely destroyed another portion of their lives, I did not bother unfolding it. I simply let it drop from my fingers. It fluttered down and landed squarely in the center of the polished oak table, right next to the silver quarter I had given to my sister. That is the official 30-day notice of eviction, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. The clock started ticking the moment I walked into this house today. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your entire perfectly curated life and leave my property completely. If there is a single scratch on the hardwood floors or a single piece of trash left behind, I will take the repair costs directly out of whatever pathetic retirement savings you have left. The room erupted into absolute chaotic madness. The facade of the perfect loving family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My mother, Brenda, suddenly turned on my father. Richard. She hit his shoulder with her open hand, screaming at him for secretly mortgaging their home for Derek entirely. You ruined us, she shrieked, her face twisted in pure ugly rage. You gave everything to him, and now we are going to be homeless, Richard screamed right back at her, blaming her for spoiling Derek and encouraging his massive inflated ego. Sienna scrambled up from the floor and lunged toward Derek, hitting his chest and sobbing wildly. You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars, she cried. You could have paid off my malpractice lawsuits, you selfish thief. You let me beg for money while you were hiding stolen corporate funds. Derek did not even try to defend himself today. He just sat there taking the physical blows from his sister, completely paralyzed by his impending federal prison sentence. They were turning on each other like starving rats trapped on a rapidly sinking ship. There was no loyalty left among them. The toxic foundation they had built their entire family upon was finally crumbling into dust, and they were desperately trying to claw each other down to save themselves. I stood there for a brief moment, watching the glorious, beautiful destruction of the people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. I had finally won the absolute war today. I turned my back on the screaming, crying mess of a family. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer a single word of closure or a final piece of advice. They did not deserve another second of my valuable time. I walked away from the dining table, my designer heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The sound of their vicious arguing faded slightly as I walked down the long hallway toward the front entryway. I grabbed my expensive leather purse and pushed the heavy oak front door open, stepping out into the cold, crisp night air today. The heavy door clicked completely shut behind me, instantly cutting off the sounds of their miserable, chaotic screaming. I took a deep, refreshing breath of the clean mountain air, letting it fill my lungs. The oppressive, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life was finally gone, completely lifted away. I looked down the long gravel driveway and smiled. Waiting for me at the end of the path was a sleek black luxury car with the engine quietly running. Standing, leaning casually against the passenger door, was Preston, my incredibly supportive and loving fiancé. Standing there, he wore a warm, gentle smile, perfectly illuminating the dark night. He did not care about my net worth or my corporate acquisitions. He loved me for exactly who I was. He opened the heavy car door for me, offering his hand to help me inside. We did not need to speak about what had just happened in that house. He saw the peaceful, absolute victory shining in my eyes, and he knew it was finally over. I settled into the heated leather seat, and he closed the door, sliding into the driver's seat rapidly and pulling away smoothly now. As we drove down the dark, winding mountain roads, leaving the luxury rental cabin far behind us, I looked out the window at the passing trees. For years, I had desperately begged for a seat at their table. I had starved myself emotionally, hoping they would finally offer me a single scrap of validation or basic human respect. I thought my value was entirely dependent on their approval. But as I watched the dark landscape roll by, I realized the absolute truth about building a beautiful, successful life. You simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that completely broke you. You have to find the incredible courage to sever the toxic roots tying you to a poisoned tree. Financial independence is not just about having millions of dollars in a private bank account. True independence is the absolute power to stand up, walk away, and never look back. It is the freedom to completely reject the false narratives forced upon you by jealous, insecure people. If your family refuses to give you a seat at their table, you do not cry. You build your own massive, beautiful table, and you only invite those who truly, deeply cherish you. The most powerful lesson learned from this story is that biology does not automatically guarantee loyalty or unconditional love. Sometimes, the people who share your blood are the exact same people who will actively try to destroy your spirit to protect their own fragile egos. For years, Gemma believed she was the problem because her parents constantly validated her narcissistic siblings while actively ignoring her achievements. She internalized their toxic behavior. But the truth is that your intrinsic value is never determined by the inability of others to recognize it. You are incredibly worthy of basic respect and true kindness. When you finally achieve financial and emotional independence, you strip away the leverage that toxic family members use to control you. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of radical self-preservation. Gemma did not walk away to punish her family. She walked away to finally protect herself. If the people at your current table constantly make you feel small or demand that you sacrifice your happiness for their comfort, it is time to leave. You must build your own table filled with people who celebrate your success instead of actively punishing you daily. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family environment to protect your own mental health and secure your future? How did you find the courage to finally build your own table? I would love to read your inspiring stories in the comments section below. If this empowering journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more incredible stories about resilience and personal growth. Share this video with someone who truly needs a reminder today that they are absolutely enough. Thank you for watching, and always remember your real worth today.